Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, in each episode, I'll be talking to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. Today, I'm joined by a prolific best-selling author, documentary filmmaker, and psychologist, David Cohen. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Nice to do so.
It's great to have you here, David. Let's start off with you telling us your backstory, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Well, okay. I left school. I left school when I was 15 and a bit, and I wanted to be an actor, the next Laurence Olivier. So I went to work in the kind of thing that no longer exists, Seaside Rep, where we did a different play every week. And after about a year and a half of it, I got a bit fed up. I was playing butlers. I also possibly played the youngest ever police sergeant in the history of the theatre, because I was about 16, but I'd already been promoted to detective sergeant in a terrible play called Get Away with Murder. I then asked a woman called Mary Lee, who claimed to have been a mistress of, I think, Edward VIII, but was now running this theatre company, for a raise, because I was actually doing a lot more than just doing small parts. And she said that I was an ungrateful so-and-so and threw me out. So I went back to my school, who'd been very annoyed that I'd gone away onto the stage. And I said, I now do want to go to Oxford, because I had very good A-levels. And the headmaster of my school said, well, I'm Jewish. He said, so I'm only going to give you a recommendation for one college, because they train Church of England vicars. Ha, ha, ha. And so I went to Keble College, which turned out to be a very good experience. And I was supposed to read history. But I'd done the Tudors and Stuarts. You did ask for a backstory. I told you it would be a bit backstory. So I was supposed to do the Tudors and Stuarts. And if I yet again had to go through the wives of Henry VIII and why the Spanish Armada was defeated, I was going to go nuts. So then, as I expect now, there was a huge, big, fat book telling you everything you could study. Mm-hmm. And I looked through it and I decided I was not going to do forestry. And I certainly wasn't going to do physics, because my maths wasn't going to be very good. But I lit upon psychology and philosophy and physiology. And because I had a scholarship, I was a scholar of the college. And, Oxford colleges are very old medieval institutions. I could just decide to choose. I didn't have to ask anybody's permission. I was part of the fellowship, which is where, by the way, of course, Tolkien, who was an Oxford man, got the whole thing of the Fellowship of the Ring. So off I went, and I started to do psychology, and I did well at it, but I still wanted to do something in media. And when I left, I went to work for Thames Television and made, at first, very short films. But I was still quite eager to do some psychology research, and I used to write on psychology for a lot of people. And the first book I ever published was a book, oddly enough, with the same publisher who's now bringing out the book Surviving Lockdown, was a book of interviews with the world's great psychologists. So I went around and I interviewed people like B.F. Skinner, like R.D. Laing, who was he was very good at mystifying himself, shall we say, and also psychologists who are much less well known now, Donald Broadbent, but who was a very, very brilliant psychologist. So, and really, I spent a lot of my life writing about psychology, and I then did a PhD because I was interested in what made children laugh. So, and I got a grant to do that. And so I've yo-yoed between making films, writing books, and doing some psychology research. So, and in some ways, I've been, it's typical that this week when you're interviewing me, I've got a book coming out soon, and I've just had a DVD of a film called London Unplugged, which I made with my son, which is about London. It's 8 short films about London, mainly made by students, but we produced it, and to use that slightly poncy word, we curated it. I'm not quite sure how you curate a film. Anyway, we got it in, and It's on Amazon. Lionsgate, who are a big company, distribute it, and it's also on iTunes and probably on iBlurb. If such, yeah, because I've been at this a long time, I do not keep up with all the social media trends. So for all I know, there may well be some sort of media called iBlurb or indeed iBurp. But if it is, it's on there. So I've done this mix of things, and I've maintained, because this comes back to the book, a very good relationship with Routledge, and its current sort of senior psychology editor has been a brilliant, or her name's Lucy Kennedy, has been a brilliant person to work with. And it must be now 4 months ago, we were having lunch, because I'm also writing a book about how Freud influenced Agatha Christie and other of the great detective writers. So we thought it would be a good idea to write a book about the psychological effects of lockdown. Mm-hmm. And our only anxiety was, well, by the time you write it, even if you write it quite quickly, which I did, and Lucy edited it very quickly, the whole thing would be out of date, because, it would have disappeared. Well, if only. So that's what happened, and I got down to researching and thinking about coronavirus.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'd love to talk more about your book, David, but first off, how are you coping with the lockdown?
Well, I am over 70, so I'm one of the vulnerable lot. And so I've spent most of it shielding. But, I coped all right. I mean, I didn't have to have food parcels delivered. So I coped all right. I had friends and, I have to explain to you also, when I was 11, 12, my mother went off to Israel because my father sort of bullied her to sell a property, and he owed money. And then after 3 weeks, I came home from school to discover he'd taken all his clothes off. Not taken all his clothes off to be naked, but he'd taken all his clothes away. So the result of that was I was on my own. I mean, I had money. I had a perfectly nice flat in the West End, and I was extremely aware that I had better not tell anybody because I'd be taken to an orphanage. So, I saw him once or twice a week. My mother came back very, very occasionally. They were both having relationships with other people. So really from the age of about 12 and 3/4 to when I was 15, 16, I basically lived on my own, going to school every day. I wrote a book about it called Home Alone. The only person who sussed something was wrong was the local dry cleaner, because I had the street smarts to know that if I turned up looking like a tramp, the school would smell something was wrong. So the dry cleaner did my clothes. So this burst of isolation reminded me very occasionally of that, when of course I did go to school, but quite often between Friday night and Monday morning, I didn't really see anybody. So, I read books, watch TV, I write. There we are.
Mm-hmm. And of course, because of the experience of lockdown, that also prompted you to, I presume this is what prompted you to write a book about isolation. And the title of your book is Surviving Lockdown, Human Nature in Social Isolation. But I suppose a lot of people will be thinking that many of us who've been under lockdown, this is the first time that we've experienced some social isolation. So is that also something that you've covered on your book?
Well, yes, and the other thing which has to be said is everything we know as psychologists, human beings are social animals. We interact. Excuse me. Solitary confinement in prisons is a form of punishment, and many people don't find it easy to cope with. There's, some people have been in solitary confinement, particularly in America, for years. It's difficult. It tends to drive people, it makes them anxious, depressed, and, it makes them lose, anchors on reality, because that's what other people give us. We may not like them, we may love them, we may not love them, but they are an anchor. We present ourselves to them, we talk to them, they reflect something back to us. Human interaction, and isolation robs us of that. Now, the lockdown has also meant people can communicate because, like you and I are communicating, we're not in the same room, but we are communicating. Then people who were locked down together with their partners, spouses, I mean, one of the more interesting statistics, though it's a bit depressing, is that the divorce lawyers have found an enormous increase in requests for advice because people find, they can't bear too much of each other. Because it's one thing if you're living in a marriage and you have breakfast and then you go off to work, both of you, or one of you goes off to work and you have the kids, and then you come back at 5 or 6, and you have a drink, you eat, you watch television, But if you're there constantly, it's much more difficult, and stresses and strains in relationships do appear. So I think there's 2 questions here. There's how do people cope with isolation if they're really alone? And then how do they cope if they're isolated with someone else? There's a famous play written by a French philosopher called Jean-Paul Sartre, whom I'm sure you've heard of, called Huis Clos. And Huis Clos is about 3 people who were essentially isolated, and A loved B, if I remember rightly, and B loved C, and C loved A, and the whole thing was a nightmare. You will be a very fortunate couple if you spend 4 months on a desert island together without wishing to drown each other.
Mm-hmm. Now, David, can you also give us some advice on how to cope with isolation and loneliness during the pandemic? Because this is something that really crops up when we talk about isolation and COVID-19. A lot of people, the experience of loneliness has been exacerbated because of this.
Well, first of all, the whole situation we've all been living in makes people anxious. You worry about whether you're going to get the virus, and if so, whether you will cope with the virus, and if, by the way, you will get medical help that works. I mean, I have a asymptomatic condition, which I won't bore your viewers with, but it means every 3 months I have to have a blood test to check it hasn't become symptomatic, which so far, thank goodness, it hasn't. Now, all the time in lockdown, I've got a good GP. I talked to him, but I haven't had anything wrong with me that required him to come and see me physically. But the anxiety, I mean, because of my experiences, when I was a teenager, I seem to be not that prone to anxiety unless it's really, really serious. And what psychologists call free-floating anxiety is, let me put it this way. If there's free-floating anxiety, I manage to float in it without being too upset about it. But you've got 2 things. The first thing is, how do you spend the time? Human beings need structure. We're used to structure. You go to school, you go to work, you go to play with your local cricket club. All that's gone. It's like we've had to structure our existence ourselves. It's not easy. It's much easier if you happen to be writing a book about social isolation. That structures your day because you've got to research bits, and it's quite manageable. Now, how you work out how to live with someone as intensively as normally in romantic relationships, at the beginning of a relationship, you can't have enough of each other. But, if you've been married 5 years, let alone 15 years, and there are children around, and there are financial pressures. I mean, today, the statistics show that 322,000 people are in arrears with their rent. Mm. Now, that makes people anxious on top of everything else. So what the virus has done is to pile one anxiety on another. Now, one thing you really do need, well, you can do, is exercise. Now, as you can see from looking at me, I'm not necessarily picture of exercising health. But if you want, I will do my exercises for you because I can still put my legs above my shoulders. Now, my mother was an exercise fanatic. She could do the splits when she was over 70. And I was always very, very resistant to her attempts to make me do all sorts of gymnastics. But one of the things I do in the book is, give people a series of exercises, all of which I have tried myself, that you can do, because they give you a sense of control. That means a very simple exercise is you put your leg up on a table and you touch your toes. You can do this while brushing your teeth. If you manage to have a toothbrush, and the other thing, that keeps you fit. So people need that to just tone themselves up as well as to pass the time.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing, which is, a cliche, is when laughter, as the Reader's Digest started saying somewhere in the 1920s, is the best medicine. So you have to find something you can laugh about, enjoy, pass the time doing, other than sitting in front of television watching repeats. A few days ago, they repeated a brilliant episode of Inspector Morse, but I remember seeing it the first time round, and I swear it was 30 odd years ago. So, it's, and you've got to keep your brain active. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that, it's not in this book, but oddly enough, it's in my book about Freud and Agatha Christie, that is totally true of human beings, is we love puzzles. If you open the Times or the Guardian or the Daily Mail or the Express, you will find pages and pages of stuff to do. I mean, the Times has a crossword, a quick crossword, a quick cryptic crossword, a brain teaser, which tests your mental health schemes, a word game where there's one letter in the middle and about 8 letters around, and you have to make lots of words, not to mention Sudoku and Krudoku and, crocodile bridge for crocodiles. Now, that's proof of our need to occupy our minds. The brain's, it's Physiology 101. The brain needs stimulation. Rob it of stimulation, and it gets unhappy, it gets distressed. And so in the lockdown, one of the things I've recommended is, 1, do exercises, quite a lot of exercises. 2, exercises are physical and exercises are mental, because they will give you some sort of sense of structure. The next thing which you have to think about is how, assuming you are in isolation with someone, is how to avoid tension points, things that make you go nuts. And there's a 1950s British comedy, with stiff upper lip, where the marriage is so bad that the man says to his son, "Herbert, get mother to pass me the salt." And mother says to Herbert, "Tell your father there is no salt, only pepper," because they can't communicate. Mm-hmm. So the ability to communicate with each other in these circumstances is crucial. Now, what we haven't talked about, and I don't know if you do want to talk about, is the way the government has coped or not coped with the situation. Because it's all very well to tell us to wash our hands and so forth, all of which is good advice. But the government's response to this thing has been an example of, really psychological muddle. There's a wonderful book which I would recommend to any of your viewers. It's not about, called On the Psychology of Military Incompetence, written in 1976 by someone called Norman Dixon. And what Dixon did, which did not make him popular with generals or admirals, was to look at many disasters like the fall of Singapore, because, the British general, I think his name was Percival, did not believe that the Japanese could attack Singapore anywhere but from the sea. So he turned all the guns towards the sea. And what did the Japanese do? they walked into Singapore by land. So incompetence on I've never run a government department. I've run a small company making TV programs. That's the most of my administrative experience. But the ability to respond to a crisis with imagination and with stability has not been shown. I mean, if the current government had been running this country, we would never have won the Battle of Britain, and Hitler would have arrived with his gang. And I'm afraid neither you nor I, because you don't look very Aryan to me, and I'm a Jew, we probably wouldn't be here. So, the governments that did do well, like the Koreans did well, particularly the South Koreans, at least initially, and the Germans did well. They weren't. I mean, the Germans now are a perfectly normal democracy. The Koreans, well, they're not a sort of fascist state. Responded quickly and flexibly. One of the countries which was most impressive is Greece, which has not much money, but they were fortunate because they had a man called Siodaris, I think I pronounced his name right, who was an expert on how to deal with pandemics. And he went to the prime minister and said, lock the country down at once, now. And the Greeks did it. And the result is, I think they've had 320 deaths the last time I looked. A country, okay, it's probably got 8 or 9 million people. We've had 440,000 deaths. I mean, okay, we have more people, but not proportionately. The Greeks did wonderfully, and that's why it's about the only country in Europe you can go and visit now, apart from Portugal.
Mm-hmm. Now, David, I want to bring a bit of statistics to you. I managed to find this study carried out by UCL, where they found out that less than 50% of people under 30 completely complied with lockdown rules. And could you just explain why this is?
Well, because they're young and they don't take it. I mean, from the outset, the emphasis was on people dying in care homes, older people. I mean, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is in his mid-50s, and he had coronavirus very badly, but he didn't die, thank goodness. Not that I agree with his politics, but, no death is to be welcomed. So I think the young, don't take it seriously. They would prefer to, I think because they think they're invulnerable. There may be an element of up yours in it, but mainly I think it's because they just feel, we're not going to get it. Granddad and grandma may, mum and dad may, but not us. We're not going to let it hamper our lives. And I think, there's also, I don't know if anyone has done a study on that, but when you live in a crisis time, when you feel, not the end of the world is nigh, but, things are going to change, things are not going to be the same. I think there is be merry because tomorrow we die. And there's a horrendous number of deaths. I think it's by now, it must be very close to 800,000 deaths worldwide. The last time I did the statistics when bringing my book, up to date, which was about 10 days ago, just at the last, before he goes to print, it was about 770,000. Now that's a dreadful number of deaths, but compare it historically. Historically, pandemics, and there have been pandemics forever, killed huge numbers of the population. I know something about the Black Death because years ago I made an ITV film about the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. I did it for the 600th anniversary of the revolt in 1981. And the Peasants' Revolt, little history lesson here, the peasants revolted because they were feeling more powerful, because the Black Death had actually wiped out, statistics differ, somewhere like 60% of the population of Europe. Now, as a result, Labour suddenly had more power. There was a movement, a kind of revolutionary movement to get rid of the aristocracy, get rid of the king. The king, who was very young, was very smart, and he summoned all the peasants to Mile End. And he said, right, you, these were the leaders, and chopped their heads off. That stopped it. But, the pandemic killed probably 60% of the population of Europe. I mean, there were pandemics. Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, wrote a journal of the plague year in 1665, when England was completely, beset with a plague. And the image we have of the plague doctor with that black helmet and the long nose comes from them. People had some inkling of some basic hygiene. They left the towns. They avoided close contact. I'm not sure they washed their hands, but they had a sort of 17th century equivalent of social distancing. And then we had the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, a century ago, and that killed at least millions of people. So, and it spread all over the world. Why it was called the Spanish flu epidemic, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows, because in fact it started in China. So I think the statistics show that this pandemic is not as bad as others. We do know a lot more about health in various ways. And communications, are much better. But it's a huge number of people to die. And I think yesterday there were over 1,500 new cases in this country alone. I mean, it's horrible and frightening, and people get frightened. So you've got, it's not just lockdown that we're dealing with and human nature in social isolation, but it's human nature in social isolation at a time of stress and anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's move on from lockdown to your rather academic work, because aside from lockdown, you also concerned about child psychology, masculinity, and theories of psychology. So, David, let's explore some of those. I managed to find out an article that you wrote for Well-Doing about whether great psychologists make good parents. Can you tell us more about it?
I'm very glad you've raised that. This is a subject which I was very interested in. So I wrote this book, which has sold absolute rubbish, which looked at how Freud, Jung, Skinner, a man called Bowlby, less familiar, but he were themselves as parents. Now, I'll take you through some of them, because Skinner, who was famous as the great behaviorist, and I met him twice, was supposed to have brought up his daughters in a kind of Skinner box, which was a kind of cage where they were reinforced if they were good, so they got a sweet, and zing if they were bad. Now, I met his daughter, who lives in London, and she was adamant this is all a complete bloody fabrication, and that he was a very good dad, and that he encouraged her. He wasn't misogynist, he wasn't sexist, and she adored him, and he adored her. Jung had a number of children, and they had to put up with the fact that he had a kind of enormously active and slightly fraught sex life, and they had to put up with lovers and mistresses and that, and yet they were very loyal to him. I mean, he took them sailing, because remember, if you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, men were not looking after their children the way we expect them to now. Freud loved mountain walking, and he took his kids mountain walking and mushroom spotting, and he was a good mountain walker in his, really actually in his 40s. He got to the top of a peak in Austria called the Dachstein, which is like 10,000 feet, but I've never climbed 10,000 feet. And his relationships with his children were interesting. I've actually written a book called The Escape of Sigmund Freud, which I'm hoping to turn into a feature film. And the child that he loved most was his youngest daughter, Anna. Anna herself became a therapist. He did something which you were not supposed to do, but then he invented psychoanalysis, so he broke the rules. He analyzed Anna. She became, to have a father analyze a daughter is now you'd be booted out of, the any analytic association. But he did it, and she became a great analyst herself. I once attended a lecture that she gave. She was an old lady. She was 82, and the Freuds escaped to England with the help of a good Nazi called Sauerwald, who's been written out of history, but I wrote him back into history a bit with my book on how Freud escaped. But Anna set up a nursery in Hampstead for traumatized children from the war. And there was she was a very, very fine child psychoanalyst. And by a mixture of, luck and persistence, I got to interview her last secretary, who was called Madame Le Bon, I think. We're talking 20 years back. And she said that Anna revered her father, who had obviously been a very good parent, and that she protected him, when he came to England. He lived in Hampstead from mid 1938 to when he died on September the 24th, if I remember rightly. And during that time, he wrote 3 books, really, or finished one and wrote 2 others. But that was with her help. So Freud's relationship with his other children was reasonable, but not so good. He lost one child called Sophie. Anna was the apple of his eye. The most R.D. Lang, whose parenting I also looked at in the book, I interviewed him about 3 times, and he was a strange and erratic bloke who was usually high as a kite after his enormous success. One of the things which I think is very difficult to handle for anyone is if they have enormous success when they are very young, and then it doesn't really continue, and the effect of that on how they deal with their children. So Lang, when he was under 30, wrote this wonderful book called The Divided Self, which really is a masterly work about what schizophrenics think and how not to drug them. But after that, he decided to write poetry, which is pretty rubbish. And he wrote other books, but he never achieved the same thing, the same success. And that was difficult for him. And his son, Adrian, wrote some material about him, good material. Adrian described to me how he had to rescue his father from the police station when at some point Lang, no doubt, having taken some substance, had slung a brick. I'm going from memory, through the police station, and the police were all for arresting him, but Adrian, who was a solicitor then, managed to get his father out. So not an ideal and top and wonderful parent. But whatever you may say about those, the parent who had the worst time, the child who had the worst time with a parent, was a woman called Melita Schmiedenberg, which you probably never have heard of her, but she was an important analyst. Her mother was Melanie Klein. Melanie Klein spent 20 years fighting with Anna Freud about psychoanalysis. And her daughter, and she really, really did not get on. And when Melanie Klein died, her daughter wore red shoes to celebrate her funeral. So that's all parents would no doubt wish to avoid, that your children celebrate your death.
Okay. Now, David, on the topic of masculinity, what's your view on toxic masculinity?
Well, I wrote a book called Being a Man a long time ago. I think toxic masculinity does not do men much good. And I think we sadly now live in a world where we have a few leaders who are fans of toxic masculinity. I must say this for our current Prime Minister here. I don't think he is that. I think he laughs too much. And I think he's actually even able to laugh at himself. And the toxic masculine macho person does not. I cannot imagine the President of the United States ever laughing at himself, laughs at other people, no doubt. Then there is Vladimir, let me bare my chest. Rubin, I will spare your view of me baring my chest, as he rampages and swims in Arctic streams, so-called. Remember, Mao Zedong swam the Yangtze River, or was filmed swimming the Yangtze River, and he was another example of toxic masculinity. The world has changed. I mean, you know, the strong, silent man, the paterfamilias who ruled the family, might have been all very well 100 years ago, but the world's changed and better, because I don't think being a buttoned-up man who doesn't speak about his feelings and who goes, yo, ho, ho, me, King Kong in central London, is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, David, I also saw an article you've written for The Guardian where it says that studies have shown that people perform better when they have written down what they need to do. So what makes a to-do list such an effective productivity tool?
Well, I think two things. One, you remember things, some of which you want to remember and some you don't. But the main thing is, once you write something down, you are the agent. You are in control. You hold the pen, okay? And that gives you, and you can then tick the list off. I mean, I've done it myself many times. You know, when you go, just before you go to sleep, or in the morning when you get up, you have the list. And you work your way through the list. You never work your way through the list 100%. I've never done that. I mean, I'm still trying to get off the ground. I mean, 40 years ago, I came across the story of the most corrupt policeman London had ever seen then, a man called Sergeant Goddard. Wonderful story, because he ran Soho in the West End. He only accepted bribes in gold. When finally the commissioner of the police caught up with him, he said, oh, I made it all in music. And anyway, I know who's sleeping with who and what the Home Secretary has been up to. And if you don't let me off, with full pension rights, by the way, I'll expose it all. Now, I have tried and tried and tried, and so it still comes up on the list to get someone, because it's not a film you can make, you know, without really a proper budget, because, you know, you need 1920 cars and 1920s nightclubs, and nobody wants to do it. So if one of your viewers wants to get in touch with me because they wish to support making this film, you'll tell them where to find me.
I'll definitely put on the link to your website. Now, as you've mentioned earlier, you've also produced a number of films and documentaries. So which one is your favorite?
No, I don't really have a favorite, but I'll mention three films. First of all, when I was working at Thames, because I have a psychology degree, I made many, many films about psychology and people. I made a film about being in Broadmoor. I mean, not that I was in Broadmoor. In fact, I've been thrown out of Broadmoor, but, you know, what the experience of being Broadmoor was like. But then I decided, because I think I said to you, if anybody remembers the beginning of the interview, that I wanted to be the next Laurence Olivier. And so I did always want to do some drama. And in 1990, I'd had a really good year as a documentary filmmaker. And I rang my bank to say, well, I'm going to pay off my overdraft. And the bank manager was appalled. Those were the days when there were bank managers, not computers. And he said, no, come and have a drink. So he invited me to a drink at a very smart hotel in Knightsbridge. And I said to him, well, look, if you really want me to continue to be in debt, give me the money to make a feature film. That was a joke. It was nearly Christmas. He said, all right, how much do you need? So I plucked the figure of £150,000 out of the air. I didn't have a script. I had a vague idea. So I made a film called The Pleasure Principle with Peter Firth about a Don Juan, and it's still around. Then many years later, I'm sure your viewers will remember the horrible Soham murders. I was introduced to the father of Holly Wells, who was murdered by there, and ITV commissioned a film from me, which was nominated for a BAFTA, and it was extraordinary because they thought, since the father was so moving and his wife was so moving and the subject was so terrible, they would not run an ad during the whole 84 minutes of the film, which is a very rare thing for them to do. So I have a serious soft spot for that, and I think it's a good film. And then one should always like one's last work, or most recent work, not last work, most recent work. So I like London Unplugged because I encouraged, with my son's Nicholas's help, a number of young people to make films about what it's like to live in London now, what it's like to look for work, what it's like to look for a place to live that you can afford, which is a perennial problem, the problems of asylum. And we found 2 short stories, because we did this one on a shoestring, by great writers who were out of copyright, which were about London. One was a story called Pictures by Catherine Mansfield, which was about a young woman who wanted to get into the pictures and ended up being a whore. And we adapted it a bit because the girl wanted to be a singer, which was partly because we found a wonderful, wonderful actress who sang very well. And also we found a story by Virginia Woolf, one of the great, great writers in the English canon, called Kew Gardens, about the comings and goings in Kew Gardens, which is, and so we made those 2, we included those 2. We did the Catherine Mansfield film, we updated it to modern times. The Kew Gardens film, we did it in the sort of timeless, might be 1920s, might be 2000 version, in the great house at Kew where they keep tropical plants. I think it's called the Palm House. So that's my latest film. I'm proud of it. We've got it out on DVD from a large-ish company. So yeah, so that's my film. I hope very much to make a film about how Freud escaped from Vienna with the help of this good Nazi, Anton Sauerwald, who helped him and didn't just help him. When Freud came to London, he said he had cancer of the jaw. He said, well, they're very good at democracy here, but they're not so good at surgery. So Sauerwald went back to Vienna, got Freud's doctor from Vienna, who wasn't Jewish, so this was about a year before the war broke out, brought him to London. The man was one of the great surgeons of Europe, and he operated on Freud and probably got him about 9 months of extra life. So I enjoy making films. I enjoy writing books.
Now, David, a particular individual who has the greatest influence to your work, whether as a psychologist or whether as a filmmaker?
That's a very good question. I think the person who was the greatest influence, oddly enough, was someone nobody will ever have heard of, called Brian Farrell. Farrell taught me at Oxford, and he was a philosopher, and he was a psychologist, and he was actually a psychoanalyst too. And he made me read all the works of Freud. Now, much of what Freud wrote is wrong, but Freud was a great, great thinker. And so, Brian Farrell has died long ago, but I will always be grateful to him. And it's an instance of how a good teacher can really leave you something that you treasure for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you've been working in the field of psychology for decades now, and you've also written pieces about psychology. And I suppose you've come across with a number of misconceptions of psychology. So if you could just tell us some of those misconceptions and sort of address those.
Well, I don't think it's so much misconceptions. I think it's people think it has answers which it doesn't have yet. So I think that's the problem. I mean, people, you say to someone you're a psychologist, and they say, oh, well, you can see into my mind. No. I think the other problem is most psychology is correlational. You find a correlation between A and B. A may not cause B. It's less perfect. I think that's the main misconception. And I worry about the number of people who advertise themselves as psychologists, because anybody can do that. You don't have to be a member of the British Psychological Association. You can't say you're a chartered psychologist unless you're a member of that. So there are all sorts of people, and when you get into the realm of people who call themselves therapists, it's even worse. I intend to start the school of vegetable therapy, and what that will do is you hold a carrot or a cucumber and you talk to it, and it gets you better. I do believe Prince Charles may be one of the patrons.
Okay. Now, David, I'm not sure if you're on Twitter, but I am on Twitter. And just a few days ago, there was a bit of, shall we say, drama between some members of the British Psychological Society and the Psychologist magazine, because some members think that the BPS, in particular, the magazine, The Psychologist, has become too political. What's your take on that?
I think John Sutton, who edits The Psychologist, is a good editor, and I see, psychology is a political business. I think it's. I would disagree with those members who say it's become too political. They should be given space in the magazine to make their point of view.
And what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work as a psychologist or a filmmaker?
Oh, I probably would be a lawyer. I mean, I actually did a year of law school, and the problem was that I saw myself in very dramatic terms, like, lawyers inside say, I defend you, he did not do it. I'm now going to cross-examine you and prove that when you said, police inspector, that my client was stabbing you or stabbing the victim, he was in fact in the bar of the Savoy having a cocktail. So that's what I saw myself as, big drama. Unfortunately, when I did, after the first year of the bar exams then, and it's so long ago now, they gave you a mentor. And they gave me a mentor who I was supposed to follow, who said, you've got a good brain, David. What you want to do is to go to the patent bar. The patent bar is where people argue about whether widget B is really a new invention. And first of all, I'm not very practically minded. I probably wouldn't recognize widget B from widget A, but it just appalled me. So I gave up the bar. So that's what I would have been.
And David, how do you relax? What's your distressing outlet?
Oh, I love watching cricket. I used to play cricket nothing much, but it is very interesting that the most successful test captain in England, in English test history, was, of course, a psychoanalyst, Mike Brearley.
And finally, David, what else is in the pipeline? And remind us again of your book, and where can we buy it?
Well, Surviving Lockdown is on Amazon, and it should be in reputable bookshops, and it should be there in about a fortnight's time. And I'm now trying to put together a deal for The Escape of Sigmund Freud. Freud was so pleased to get out of Germany because it freed him to write, that he actually did say to someone, he sometimes thinks, thank the Führer.
Well, David, I'm sorry, I was, carry on. Would you like to add something else?
Yeah, that's all. Those are the two things I'm into.
Okay, well, David, it's been an insightful conversation with you. Thank you for sharing your expertise and, of course, your book. I look forward to hearing more about your work. Again, thank you for joining me here at the DRH Show.
Thank you, DRH Show.